Great. All I see is my screen, so I'm just going to be talking to myself. Hopefully other people are watching, but thank you so much, Linda, and thank you for inviting me to do this. Yeah, so I am currently at Chaco Canyon Archaeological Center here in Colorado, which I guess is why I qualify to talk to you guys. But this is really research that I did at Binghamton as a grad student there. This was my dissertation. So let me tell you about the archaeology of the Aztec North Great House. Okay, so for those of you who maybe haven't been there or don't know that much about this part of the world, we're going to be talking about Aztec Ruins National Monument, which is in northern New Mexico. And those are the approximate dates, and we'll be talking more about the early end of that today. It is a Chacoan outlier, or at least at a certain point it became a Chacoan outlier. It's the biggest Chacoan outlier. So that means monumental great house construction, and that is what you're looking at here. This is a great house called Aztec West. If you've ever been to Aztec Ruins, that's the one you visited probably. All right, but the story actually begins a little further away in Chaco Canyon. But first, let me just say a few words about the project. So we did this excavation in 2016, and yes, it takes a while to write up your results after an excavation like this. It was not a big excavation. I'll show you. We did 4 test units, really. We were up there for about a month. And that's my crew, basically. A few people are missing, but 9 people or so. So even with a small excavation, you end up with a lot of data to process and write up. So I should acknowledge that all of my friends did this without any pay, and probably there are some familiar faces in there, but that's my crew. All right, and also people helped analyze artifacts, which I'll be talking about today. Okay, so starting back to Chaco Canyon. So probably everybody knows a little bit. I'm not going to drag this out, but just wanted to say a few words so we're all on the same page. So Chaco Canyon is also in northern New Mexico. I believe it's like 90 kilometers away from Aztec. I'll show you a map in a few minutes. It's further south. And Chaco is this dry, arid canyon. And starting in the 850s, people started building these enormous structures, these great houses. And it lasted until about 1140, which is relevant to the talk today too. So the great houses, the most famous one is Pueblo Bonito, the biggest one, the central one maybe. So yes, monumental architecture. Pueblo Bonito had hundreds of rooms. It was at least 3, I think 4, maybe even 5 stories high. And so many of the other great houses were multiple stories as well. Just huge, huge, monumental. Pueblo Bonito in particular is really known for a small number of burials of people who seem to be extraordinary in some way based on the way that they were buried. They were buried in crypts within the great house with a lot of things, a lot of goods, prestige goods, in very choreographed sort of ways. And it seems like people went back into the crypts over time and buried people for generations in the same place. And that doesn't look like anything else anywhere else in the Southwest. So that's special about Chaco. We've got prestige goods coming from huge distances, scarlet macaws from Mexico, cacao from Mexico, copper bells from Mexico, shell from the Pacific coast, all kinds of things coming into this place. We have lots of evidence for ritual activity, ritual goods stored in huge quantities in the back rooms of Pueblo Bonito, for example. So for a lot of archaeologists, what we see at Chaco is social hierarchy, and in a place where you wouldn't really expect it, this sort of remote and arid canyon. The main thing I want to talk about today with Chaco is the architecture of the great houses and just a few features, because we're going to be sort of tracing that at Aztec. So these were masonry buildings built with stone that was shaped, for the most part, into little blocks to make these beautiful, beautiful masonry walls. Not everything at Chaco is quite as perfect as these pictures, but this gives you an idea of sort of the architecture. And it's sort of overbuilt because you know, they put all that work into building that wall, and then they plastered over it, we think, in white. So you wouldn't actually have been able to see all of that work. The logs I'm showing in the bottom picture there, those are logs. They were probably, most of the logs at Chaco were brought in from the Chusca Mountains. Again, I think it's like 70 miles away, would have had to be carried. So just an enormous amount of work went into doing that. I believe there were something like 200,000 logs brought into Chaco to build the great houses. And then the thing I really want to talk about on the right is core and veneer construction. So that is how these buildings at Chaco are made. They've got the beautiful veneer, the sandstone, like you see on the left, on both sides of the wall. And then in the core, the center of it, is stone rubble mixed with mortar. So it's strong. And the idea is to make these walls really thick and really strong. But it is stone rubble. This was a really important innovation that we think probably came out of Chaco Canyon, and that made it possible to go multiple stories high. So the region we're going to be talking about today, some people call it the Middle San Juan. I like the Navajo word for the region, which is Tota, only because it gives you some sort of sense of the place. It means rivers coming together, and there are 3 rivers that come together in the Tota region. So on my map here, Chaco is down at the bottom. It's the big green blob. Aztec Ruins is due north of Chaco, and it's on the Animas River in the Tota. So Aztec Ruins, I guess I should have said maybe, obviously has nothing to do with Aztecs. Those were people in Mexico. It was misnamed by settlers in the 1800s. And so I like to bring some of the indigenous names, and I'm actually trying to collect those, but the one that I really know about is the Tia Pueblo name for Aztec, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, but what it means is the place where cattails grow. And I love it just because it gives you this sense of this place that's really wet. Pueblo people think of this as a wet place because of the Animas River. Early Anglo settlers at Aztec also talked about seeing ancient irrigation canals, so it's possible that there was some irrigation going on in this place off of the river as well. So in a good year, the Animas River is amazing. It comes down from the mountains, it's bringing the snow melt, and in good times, you have a lot of water. In bad times, not so much. So these are 2 consecutive years. You can see on the left, there's a lot less water in the river at that time. So just to point out that the river is great in good times, but doesn't necessarily insulate you from drought, which is also part of the story at Aztec. And if you did have irrigation canals, there's a certain point at which your canal would be empty if it's coming off the bank of that river. So again, if any of you have been to Aztec West, you've probably walked through these rooms. You're seeing the original ceilings. And it is a Chacoan great house. Aztec West is actually the biggest great house outside of Chaco Canyon. It has 400 rooms. It was at least 3 stories high. Has that beautiful Chacoan masonry, has the core and veneer walls, and has another feature. And both the core and veneer walls and footer trenches, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, both of those are considered low visibility features. So the idea is if you saw it under construction, you'd see how it was built, but once the great house is finished, if you visit the great house, you'll see the veneer, but you won't know what's in the middle of the walls. And you won't know about footer trenches. So footer trenches were also a Chacoan innovation where they dug into the ground and put in rocks and mortar to support the walls. This was another way that they made it possible to go up multiple stories. And I'll show you a picture of a footer trench in a little bit. So those low visibility, very Chacoan features. Aztec West was also full of artifacts that look very much like the things that have been found at Chaco Canyon. Some of them are so similar that archaeologists have argued that they were made by the same people or people who were trained at the same time, same place. Aztec West was extensively excavated, obviously, since you can walk through it today, but that happened a long time ago. It was the early 20th century. Earl Morris was a great archaeologist, but he didn't always write everything up as much as we would have liked, and also he just didn't know about a lot of the methods that we have now. So part of what was exciting about digging at Aztec, we have all this great data from the early 20th century, and now we can add some new things with some new methods. I also always want to give a shout out to his wife, Anne Axtell Morris, who was right there with him working on this and did a lot of his drawings and profiles, and also wrote a couple of books that were bestsellers at the time. Okay, so there are actually 3 great houses at Aztec. This again is Aztec West that you're seeing here. Aztec East would be off to the right somewhere. And then Aztec North is up on top of the hill, somewhere behind those cottonwoods. So an important thing to know is that first we've got 3 great houses, and 2 of them are down in the valley, and 1 of them is up on this hilltop. This is a map I made of that cultural landscape and sort of shows you everything. And I don't think you can see my cursor, but over on the left is Aztec West. Aztec East is on the right, to the east, obviously. In between them, there's a little mound, and then a road goes up, and these red lines are topo lines. So a road goes up to Aztec North, starting basically right in the center between the 2 of them. So these 3 great houses are basically in a triangle to each other, and there's a road that goes up the center. A little ways up the road, almost all the way up to Aztec North, there are 2 little structures on either side of the road. And I think those were actually there to show you like the right way to walk up to Aztec North, because actually when you're at Aztec West or Aztec East, you can't see the great house on top of the terrace. So I think those little buildings were sort of there to show you the proper way to process up the hill towards Aztec North. So really elaborate and sort of choreographed landscape. And it's also a landscape that seems to be intentionally recreating the Chacoan landscape. So my PhD advisor, Ruth Van Dyke, wrote about this, and Steve Lexham has written about this too. So on the left is a little image showing you roughly the layout of the Chacoan, of downtown Chaco. So Pueblo Bonito, which I mentioned before, Chetroketal, and Pueblo Alto. And there is that road that goes up the side of the mesa to Pueblo Alto. Aztec on the right is essentially recreating that relationship of 3 great houses with the road in the middle, and also the rivers are in the same place, although Chaco Wash can't really call it a river most of the year. So they're recreating it. There is, however, a slight tilt, and we can maybe talk about that a little later. All right, so Aztec North, as Linda said, had never been excavated. There'd been some survey up there. We knew a little bit about it, but it was kind of just mysterious because it doesn't look from the surface. It doesn't look like other great houses do. This is a picture of Aztec West before it was excavated. Obviously, standing walls, it's pretty clear that you're looking at a ruin. And if you visit other unexcavated Chacoan great houses, they might not be quite that spectacular, but at least you'll see lots of sandstone lying around. It'll be sort of obvious that you're at a great house. This is what Aztec North looked like before my excavation. Hold on, I accidentally hid that from myself. I'm sorry, everyone. Let me get that going again. Okay, so the picture on the right at the bottom is Aztec North before we excavated, and that's what it looks like now too. It doesn't look like much. There is obviously a mound, and you can't really see it in the picture, but when you're walking across this landscape, it's obvious that there's a big mound. And what archaeologists had sort of thought before we excavated was that this was mostly an adobe structure, because there's no standing walls and there's very little sandstone to be seen on the surface. So we kind of thought that what we were going to find was an adobe structure that had mostly melted. And that's why there's this mound without any actual walls. But we started excavating. Well, let me get to my research questions first. So I'm going to organize the talk around these research questions. I'll go through this real fast right now and then go into a little more detail with each one. So first, site chronology. When was it built? How does that relate to the other great houses? The construction methods. Was it adobe? Was it something else? relations with Chaco Canyon and with other regions. And then the fourth question, daily life and subsistence. What did people eat? What did people do? To give you an idea of our research design, so this is an image, this is the park's map of Aztec North. The building is the gray thing in the center, as they had mapped it before we excavated. And then all around it, there are features that are associated with it. We put in 4 study units. 2 of them were fairly big, 6 by 1s, 8 by 1. So that's not big, but bigger than the others. 6 by 1 meters and 8 by 1 meters, I believe. The first one was at the back of the Great House, and the idea was to find the back wall of the Great House. If you imagine that it's an adobe structure that has sort of melted and you've just got a mound, it's really hard to know where exactly the wall is. So that's what we were looking for there. Study Unit 2 is in the east wing of the Great House, and that was an area that had been disturbed a little bit by pot hunters. So we were able to get permission to excavate there and see what kind of damage had been done and to see the architecture. And then we have these 2 little units in the middens. The middens, the trash mounds, were pretty deflated, pretty thin. There wasn't a lot to see there, but we did do some excavation in there. Okay, so the first research question, site chronology. So here's kind of what we knew about Aztec to begin with. The main burst of construction at Aztec West began around 1110. There's really not evidence for earlier habitation there. So 1110, we've got Aztec West going. It's done, mainly done by 1120, and then construction begins on Aztec East. That's going along, and then the drought sets in and things start changing, and Chaco, for various reasons, seems to be in decline. The last cutting date from Chaco Canyon is 1140. But Aztec, maybe because it's on this river, maybe for other reasons, keeps going way after Chaco. And it actually is occupied until the late 13th century, when the whole Four Corners region empties out and people head off to the Rio Grande or other places. And the question for me was, where does Aztec North fit into this? So some people had said it must be earlier than Aztec West. That was sort of the going theory, and partly based on Pete McKenna had done some ceramic analysis from the surface at Aztec North. So we did know that there was some pottery that fits in to that kind of time period before Aztec West. Steve Lexon, if any of you have read his Chaco Meridian book, he hypothesized that Aztec North was built much later, that it was sort of an experiment in adobe construction before moving on to Pacame. That's a whole other story. But these were sort of the 2 hypotheses. And another possibility, I think, was that it was concurrent with Aztec West, that Aztec West and Aztec North go in at the same time. So of course, what we hoped to find was those big beams that we could use for tree ring dating. That's the most effective way of dating a site here in the Southwest. We did not have any such luck. You know, with meter-wide units, it was always unlikely that we would find them. But what we did find a lot of is corn cobs and organic materials. So that's a little burnt corn cob on the right. And on the upper left is a piece of corn stalk that's actually sitting in a chunk of adobe, so that would actually date the actual construction. And so these were items that we could send for radiocarbon dating. And that's me on the bottom collecting a little corn cob. So the radiocarbon dating, I was able to get an NSF grant to do some pretty significant radiocarbon dating. And the best I can say for it is that things lined up really well, which is kind of one thing that you want. We had a really pretty clear occupation sometime between 1025 and 1155 AD. So that's nice, but that's definitely not going to answer my questions about how it relates to the other great houses. It's just too broad of a range, and that's what you get with radiocarbon dating, especially in this time period for various reasons. I did do some Bayesian statistical modeling to try to figure out the probability, and that pointed at a probability of construction sometime closer to 1100, but far from conclusive and really doesn't answer those questions still. but we have other methods. So we used mean ceramic dating, which basically uses the, here in the Southwest, we have really good dates on when certain types of pottery were made. So once you decide what type of pottery you're looking at, it's, excavata black on white, we know the dates when that was made. And then you can, so basically I have the gray column here is the count of sherds. So we had 4 excavata black on white sherds, and basically it's a mathematical process to then figure out a mean ceramic date based on how many sherds you have of each type. The mean ceramic date for Aztec North came out as 1101 plus or minus 38. That's a standard deviation. So that looks good. 1101 would be clearly before Aztec West. Lines up nicely also with my Bayesian modeling. But it really, mean ceramic dating is really a little imprecise. It really could be any time in that 70-year, more than 70-year range. So I can't say that 1101 is the year that it was built. That's clearly not what mean ceramic dating means. But it does narrow the range a little bit, and we were actually able to narrow it more because we realized that there were no San Juan redwares at this site, which we would expect for a site that was built before 1070. So I actually think this site, based on the ceramics, was built between 1070, was occupied between 1070 and 1139. All right, so here's where we're at. Radiocarbon dates, long range, ceramic dates, narrowed down a little bit, but still doesn't answer my question, right? We've got some things that are suggestive, but we still can't say, was it built before Aztec West? So we've got one more line of evidence, which is the architecture, and I'll talk about that and then circle back to the dates. Okay, so like I said, on the surface of the site, this is what the surface looked like. There was not sandstone lying around, but there were these big river cobbles. We kind of figured what we were going to see was a lot of adobe and mixed in with some river cobbles. People call it bowling ball construction in this area. That's what we were expecting. And that's kind of what we were seeing as we started digging, but then we started seeing sandstone. Pieces of sandstone even seemed like veneers falling. And then we got down to the bottom of the units to the floors, and above the floors we found coursed masonry veneer. So both of these pictures are showing courses of sandstone that was shaped to some extent. It's not beautiful masonry veneer. It's not like Pueblo Bonito, but it's the same idea. It also clearly was core and veneer in the sense that there's 2 veneers. I don't know if you can see that in this picture. But what's in the middle is the weird thing, and what's in the middle is adobe. So the core of these core and veneer walls, instead of being stone rubble like we would expect from a Chacoan building, is adobe. And it actually seems to be just kind of handfuls that were smushed in, packed in. I don't think that it was, I know that it wasn't bricks or anything formal like that. It was just kind of dropped in there. And then we kept going, and under the walls we found very sort of classically Chacoan footer trenches. So what they did here, you can see there are 2 courses of these big river cobbles. This whole thing is, I can't remember exactly what the depth was, 30 centimeters, something like that. And they're set in a very hard mortar. This would probably was laid out, mortar poured in, and then left to cure for maybe months to dry. And it was very, very strong and hard. And this is the kind of footer that is used at Chaco to support 3-story walls. At Aztec North, it was supporting walls that are very ephemeral, clearly only 1 story high. Because of that adobe, we really didn't even, except for where the coarse masonry was, it was very hard to see the walls at all because they were mostly adobe and they kind of melted away. So until we actually got to the footer trenches, we weren't quite even sure where all the walls were. All right, so then the field crew wraps up, everybody goes home, and I'm left to figure out what exactly all this means. So what we've got is some features that are very Chacoan. We've got the footer trenches, we've got masonry, we've got the idea of core and veneer. They're clearly trying to do that. We've got the size and shape of the great house. So I showed you that picture. I should have pointed out it's very sort of D-shaped, kind of a classical Chacoan shape. Size, if this thing was anywhere other than Aztec, it would be the biggest thing around. It's a very large great house, probably 100 rooms, although it was not multiple stories, at least where we excavated. It's also in the high place, which is kind of a thing Chacoans like to do. And it's got this elaborate cultural landscape, also kind of typically Chacoan. On the other hand, it has those adobe cores, which are not Chacoan. And remember how I mentioned earlier that those are a low visibility feature. You wouldn't necessarily know what was in the interior of a great house if you hadn't seen one being constructed before. So in the end, I think where I fall is that this was constructed by people who had not built a great house before. So these are not Chacoans coming from Chaco to build a new great house at Aztec North. They're using what is sort of a traditional construction method. Adobe is kind of what people used in the Animas Valley, not exactly at Aztec, but in the area. So they're sort of using their traditional construction, but mixing it with the masonry, which is coming from Chaco. And they do have some Chacoan knowledge. So they have those footer trenches. That's low visibility, if anything is. So they do have that. One thing I think is really clear from the architecture is that Aztec North has to predate Aztec West. If it was built later, well, first of all, I should say that the radiocarbon dates eliminate the Steve Lexham possibility of a very late construction. And I think the architecture tells us that it was built before Aztec West, because by the time Aztec West is built, there are Chacoans, or at least someone with all the whole package of Chacoan knowledge is there building Aztec West. Aztec North, they didn't have that yet. Okay, so here we are back on the timeline. So I think construction was between 1070 and 1110. 1070 because there's no San Juan redwares. 1110 based on the architecture. Just has to predate Aztec West. The occupation based on the ceramics ends by 1139 or thereabouts. So it doesn't continue the way that Aztec West and Aztec East continue, although there's some evidence that they were like trying to keep it from falling down because it was important to have that great house on the hill, even if you weren't occupying it. So some of my dissertation has been just thinking through the significance of adobe versus masonry. You know, archaeologists in this part of the world, it's not true in other places, but archaeologists here tend to equate Chaco and stone with complexity, with knowledge, with ritual, with all the things that we think Chaco represents: hierarchy, social hierarchy, elites who are mobilizing, who are able to get other people to build things for them. We also, I think, have a real prejudice and an assumption that men were the people building the great houses, something I'll talk about again in a second. And when we think about adobe in the Chacoan world, we tend to think of it as expedient, egalitarian, local. There were a lot of complaints on my site about the crappy adobe that we were digging through. It's not as cool as the Chacoan masonry. And all of that, of course, is despite this long history of adobe before the Chaco-era and after the Chaco-era. So after people leave the Four Corners area, what they start building is adobe pueblos. This is Taos Pueblo, which is 900 years old. So that's another thing to know about adobe. You can build really big things. And if you maintain it properly, which means maintaining it every year, it lasts for a really long time. And so in thinking about the labor that is associated with the adobe, I really think that this was an experiment. So yes, they were building with adobe before. They built houses and small things. Building a great house is a whole other kind of thing. And a great house with 100 rooms, even if it's just that core, that's 100 rooms of dropping mud in between your veneers. So I think it was experimental. I think we've got a community here that's going from one thing to another, that's trying to transition, trying to become Chacoan, as my title says. But what you need for Adobe is a lot of hands and a lot of feet. So especially when you're building on this scale. So I think that this was all hands on deck. Children, women, elderly folks could have all helped with mixing mud and putting it into place. Probably kind of an egalitarian labor regime, this whole village coming together to create that Adobe Core. But at the same time, they're clearly turning towards the Chacoan labor relations that we think we see when we look at Masonry. They're trying to become more Chacoan, and they do become more Chacoan at Aztec West. And I just wanted to highlight this picture. So again, if we think that men must be the stonemasons, in the Pueblo world, women traditionally were at least the ones who plastered every year. But also there's really good evidence that especially before the Spanish arrived, women were the house builders. And that's also true around the world where people build with Adobe. It's usually groups of women who get together and do it. So just to highlight that it wasn't necessarily just the men working on this great house. Okay, moving on to my next research question, relations with Chaco Canyon with other regions. So as Carrie talked about earlier, temper is the way that we can study where pottery came from. And here in the Four Corners, we can really tell really well where pottery came from within 50, 60 mile ranges. So I was able to actually tell which pottery came from the Chisca Mountains versus from the Cibola, which is the Chaco area versus what's local. And the answer is that there's a lot of imported pottery at Aztec North. So of the grayware, which is generally the cooking ware, 69% of it is local, which is what you'd expect, but 19% of it came from the Chisca Mountains. Of the whiteware, again, most of it is local, but 26% of it came from the Cibola, which is Chaco, and another 12% came from the Chiscas. So we have just a lot of pottery that's being imported from other places. And that is part of the Chacoan pattern. That is exactly what you would expect at a Chacoan outlier great house. So I think what this tells us is that despite whatever's going on with the architecture, whoever is building that, it's pretty clear that pretty soon after construction, they're totally in on the Chacoan game. So they're very quickly enmeshed in Chacoan patterns and relationships. They become Chacoan. They become part of, they become a Chacoan outlier pretty quick. Chipped stone, I feel like I have to talk about it, but it wasn't all that exciting for the most part. There's an exception. Callum Throgmorton, my colleague, analyzed all the chipped stone, and he found that it was mostly pretty much local materials. These are the 4 projectile points that we found at the site, and they were all from local materials. And things were kind of expedient. If you needed to cut something, you would take one of those river cobbles that are everywhere on the terrace, and you would smash it and flake it a little bit, and then just use that. So not a lot of really formal tools. The one thing that was really exciting was the obsidian that we found at Aztec North. There's a lot of it. I'll talk about that in a second. It all comes from the Jemez Mountains. Jeffrey Ferguson actually sourced it all for us, and it's all from Jemez. The source is not that surprising. What is surprising is the quantity. So I had 152 pieces of obsidian at Aztec North. This chart shows some other sites. So the biggest one, 196, that's Chaco. That's like everything that has ever been excavated, that was excavated as part of the Chaco project between 1020 and 1120. And they had 196 pieces. And that's for a centuries, for sites that dated to that century. To the left of that is the central Mesa Verde sites that Chaco Canyon has excavated, a lot of them again, and there's 167 pieces. Salmon Ruins, the whole Pueblo was excavated. They had 131 pieces. And I've got 152 pieces from my 4 little study units that we excavated in a month, and for a site that I think probably at most lasted for 69 years. So I think it's just a lot. There's other differences, the way they were using it. So the Chaco and Mesa Verde sites in this time period, the Chacoan time period, mostly had finished tools and a lot of projectile points. that's where you found the obsidian as finished tools. At Aztec North, it was mostly debitage, informal tools, kind of expedient things. Again, if they needed a piece, they would just flake it off and use it. And Kellum found that the knapping techniques were also very much the same as local materials. They weren't saving it for bifaces or for projectile points. It was almost as if they could get their hands on more. It wasn't something particularly precious. They knew they could get more. The other big difference that we're sort of thinking about is it seems like it only came from 2 of the 3 sources that are available in the Jemez. And actually, it sounds like they would have had to walk past the 3rd one in order to get to those other 2, or the other way if people were bringing it here. So overall, the Aztec North pattern just looks really different from other sites in this region. We're working on a paper exploring what that means, Kellum and Jeff and I. Is there some kind of kinship relationship? Is it about trade? But it's different than Chaco. Okay, the 4th research question, daily life and subsistence. Here again is a place where we have new methods that Earl Morris didn't have. He wasn't really even asking questions about, he wasn't collecting every animal bone that he saw or trying to collect seeds. So we were able to do things at Aztec for the first time. Well, this was one of the first sources of data on this at Aztec. So as far as the animal bones, there weren't that many of them. It was a pretty small assemblage, but I could tell you a few things. The proportion to rabbits and archaeodactyls was about equal. The other 30% was things like rodents and birds. So that proportion of rabbits to deer is pretty similar to other Chaco sites like Salmon Pueblo and Pueblo Alto, which is interesting. At least you can say they hadn't overhunted the deer. There were no carnivores or birds of prey or any of the exciting things that sometimes people find at great houses. There were 3 turkey bones. I can't tell you anything about what they did with their turkeys, but they had turkeys. The other thing we found that was pretty cool is fish vertebrae. So these were little tiny vertebrae that I found in the screen. They came from pretty near a hearth, so I can't say with 100% certainty that this was food, but I think it probably was. And that's interesting because people have tended to think in the past that Pueblo people, ancestral Pueblo people, didn't eat fish, that it was a taboo. And that's partly because some of the Pueblos and other Native American groups in the area had that taboo in historic times, so people kind of assumed it. And it's partly because you don't find that many fish. And I still think it's true that it probably wasn't their favorite food. It's not something we find a lot of, but I think, and talking to other colleagues who are doing research in this area, especially in the Tota, where there are these rivers, people have found fish, and it seems pretty clear that ancestral Puebloans were eating fish at least sometimes. So the Archaeobotanical Analysis, we collected lots of soil samples for flotation, and the flotation and the analysis were done by my friends Nikki Burkbile and Dr. Karen Adams, and we got some really cool data. So a lot of it is what you'd expect. We found a lot of corn, maize, found some of the wild plants that are edible and wonderful around here: Indian ricegrass, tansy mustard, prickly pear, ground cherries, junipers, purslane. Got some plants coming up from the river, the bulrush and the reed. Those are both river plants. The wood was mostly local. We didn't have any ponderosa or anything too exciting. But the one thing we found that is really exciting, and we're actually working on a paper, we have written a paper on this, we found the first domesticated amaranth that we know of. I'm quite confident that it's the first at a Chacoan great house. I'm pretty sure that it's the first at any ancestral Puebloan site in the Four Corners. So amaranth. On the left, you see a picture of wild amaranth from my backyard, and you probably have some of it in your backyard too, because it's a weed that grows everywhere around here. It's a little plant, and it does have edible seeds, and we know that ancestral Puebloan people ate those seeds. We find those in archaeological assemblages. They're a little hard to tell from another plant, from Chenopodium, so people call them chemoanth. because we can't tell which one it is exactly. They're these tiny, tiny little seeds, but they're nutritional powerhouses. They have a lot of nutritional value. So amaranth was domesticated in a few places, but most relevantly in Mexico. And we actually have records from when the Spanish arrived in Mexico that amaranth was hugely important economically and ritually. So it was being grown everywhere in Mexico and was very important there. And it's been found before, domestic amaranth has been found before at Chacoan sites in Arizona. But this is, as far as I know, the first evidence of it in the ancestral Pueblo world, which is exciting. So that amaranth on the right, you can see, obviously, it just has a ton more seeds than the wild amaranth would. If you're going out there to collect seeds, you're going to have a lot more luck with the domesticated kind. The seeds themselves aren't significantly bigger. They're a little bigger. They're still tiny little seeds. And we know that Zuni people added amaranth to corn flour to enrich it because it's so much more nutritious than corn is and has some of the nutrients that corn lacks. We also know that they use those pink flowers. This is actually a Hopi variety that my friend Vern Hensler is growing in Aztec. It's a Hopi variety. They call it a dye amaranth because they use those pink and red flowers to make a dye, which they use to dye food. It was actually to make red piki bread. That flat bread that they make at Hopi. And the Zuni also used it for that. So the seeds we found, here's pictures of them. So like I said, if your seeds are burnt, and usually seeds only preserve if they're burnt, they're just black and it's hard to tell because they shrink. And so it's hard to tell the domesticated from the wild if they are burnt. But we were lucky enough that we had this uncharred little cache of amaranth seeds, and Karen was able to identify them as domesticated. And there are two, at least, she said 3 different colors. There's a light tan, there's a dark tan, and there's a black. And there's also 2 sizes. There's the big ones, and she thinks the smaller ones are also domesticated because they're still bigger than the wild ones are. So we've got a lot of variety, and a lot of this is new in the literature. When people talk about domesticated amaranth, they describe it as white or pale. So these darker shades are actually a new kind, haven't really been talked about. So that's exciting. And I actually think that the color is relevant. As a lot of you will know, Pueblo people with corn, they like to have different colors of corn. That matters ritually and sort of agriculturally. So I think they might have actually been intentionally selecting for black seeds and dark seeds because they needed that. So this is an exciting Archaeobot find. All right, to wrap up here, overall, so our takeaways. The Aztec North Great House was constructed before Aztec West, and I think the dates were between 1070 and 1110. It was built by people who had not built a great house before, so not Chacoan builders, whatever that means, but they did have some limited Chacoan knowledge in the shape of those footers. I really see this as a moment of transition from this communal labor system to the more top-down labor system represented by the stone working. The artifacts, the pottery, is mostly very typical of a Chacoan great house. That switch over between maybe not Chacoan to Chacoan happens really quickly. But the obsidian suggests that there's something else going on there, some kind of different trade relations than what Chaco had. I also like to emphasize, again, this connection to this wet place, the river, with the fish, the plants, and the use of adobe. So it's really a wet place compared to Chaco and to other sites. All right, and I want to say thank you to a lot of people who are standing behind me, did a lot of this work in the field and in the lab. And also I want to thank my funders there. All right, that's all I've got. And I will stop sharing.
Okay, are there any questions for Michelle? Please post them in the chat box. Take a deep breath. That was excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I should say I don't have a book to sell yet, like Carrie.
Oh, come on.
But we're getting there, and I'm definitely working on some publications.
Well, I'm not having you come back unless you've got a book to push.
Okay.
Uh,
Any questions?
I see 2 comments or questions in the chat box.
Yes, the book will come.
Great.
Okay.
Wait, more thanks.
Okay, somebody mentioned Bisani is another bonito-faced Chacoan outlier built with Adobe. That is true, and I probably should have mentioned it. It's near Chaco Canyon. It's different though because it doesn't have the veneers. So yes, another thing that the book will talk about is how those two things relate to each other.
Great. And okay, we have a few minutes before Katie's up, but thank you so much, Michelle. And
thank you for the invitation.
Hopefully one of these days, again, as I said with Carrie, we'll do face-to-face stuff.
Yeah.
That would be nice. Thanks a bunch.